Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and on this episode, we will be discussing a Poirot short story. It is time to review and analyze The Third Floor Flat. I can count on one hand the number of these Poirot short stories we have left, which makes me very sad, but let's not wallow in that sadness. Let us instead focus on the joy of having a Poirot short story to discuss in the here and now. The publishing history of The Third Floor Flat is pretty straightforward. It was first published in the UK in Hutchinson's Adventure and Mystery Story magazine in January 1929. It wasn't collected in book form in the UK till much, much later, in 1974. In Poirot's early cases, this was the sole new Christie for that year. It was the Christie for Christmas, a short story collection, which followed the publication of Postern of Fate in 1973. That, of course, was the final book Christie wrote. And this would be the year before Curtain was to come out in the final year of Agatha Christie's life. So in a way, it's fitting that we are covering this short story now on the podcast, although I will be honest with you, that is a coincidence. Coincidences happen in Agatha Christie mysteries, and they also happen in real life. In the US, this short story appeared in the book collection Three Blind Mice and Other Stories in 1950. I suspect that it was also published in a periodical in the US at some point, probably in the 30s, if not in 1929. But I do not have any record of that. I was not able to find a reference to a US serialization. If you know, give me a shout. I'd love to hear. All right, so let's discuss the victim of our story. That would be Mrs. Ernestine Grant, who was found shot to death in her flat, which would be the titular third floor flat, in a building inhabited by none other than Hercule Poirot. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's talk about our suspects. Of course, Poirot is not one of them. First up, we have Donovan Bailey, who is an attractive young man with a, quote, lazy, pleasant voice that matched his lean, dark figure. Next is Jimmy Falconer, another young man, and now I'm quoting again, short, broad-shouldered, with good-tempered blue eyes. Next, we have Patricia Pat Garnett. She is referred to as Pat for most of the story, except by Poirot, who likes to call her Mademoiselle Patricia. Pat is a fetching young lady who seems to be unable to keep track of her front door key or to remember to bolt the coal lift in her kitchen. And she has a friend who is our next suspect. That would be Mildred Hope, the fourth member of this party of youngins. Mildred is, quote, a sensible girl, not nearly so attractive as the impulsive and troublesome Pat. And finally, we have John Fraser, an enigmatic man who seems to be both exceedingly careful and careless. We'll get there. Let's just get right into it in the world as it appears to be. Pat cannot find the key to her flat, and we've all been there before. She appeals to the two gentlemen friends she's been out with that night. That, of course, would be Jimmy Falconer and Donovan Bailey, and also to Mildred Hope, the other young woman of the party. But no luck. They do not have the key. It is seemingly nowhere to be found. Pat knows that its only copy is hanging up inside her flat's kitchen. She wishes that she had a ground floor flat instead of the fourth floor flat in which she lives. And she asks Donovan jokingly if he'd like to be a cat burglar. He declines, but then Donovan suggests the service lift as a possible point of entry into Pat's flat. Pat negates this. She says it's only a sort of wire basket thing. But this makes her think of the coal lift, which should be bolted on the inside of Pat's kitchen. But as we're learning, Pat isn't so reliable about matters involving keys and locks and such things. So the coal lift it is. Pat leads this foursome of young people to the ground floor of her building and then into the well of the flats, which I suppose is a sort of basement where they can access the coal lift, which presently has a dustbin on it. Donovan removes the dustbin. He steps on, wrinkling his nose at the smell. Jimmy manfully agrees to join him. And so up they go, hauling on the rope to lift themselves to the third floor aperture. It is at this point in the story that the building is referred to as Friars Mansions and not Whitehaven Mansions, which of course is Poirot's address, often in the text and always in the Suchet adaptations of those texts. We'll get into the Suchet of it all later in the episode, of course, but I did just want to note that this is not actually Whitehaven Mansions, it's Friars Mansions. And we do sometimes get these alternate addresses for Poirot, especially I think in some of the earlier short stories. But I was certainly picturing the Whitehaven Mansions building that we've all, or at least most of us, have come to know and love through the Suchet series. And we'll be spending a bit of time in that very building when we talk about the adaptation for this episode. So just wanted to give the proper sense of place for Christie's text. Donovan and Jimmy get up to what they seem to believe is the fourth floor, except that Donovan can't switch on the light in the kitchen. He's able to open up the door to the coal lift and kind of jump inside the kitchen. But when he tries to turn on the light, it won't turn on. Dud bulb, I suppose, is what he says. So Donovan toddles on over to the sitting room where he proceeds to crash in the dark into a bunch of furniture that seems not to be where it should be. And then he turns the sitting room light on. And at this point, Jimmy is there as well. And both these men realize they're in the wrong flat. Oopsie. They see from a pile of letters on a table in the sitting room that this is the flat of a Mrs. Ernestine Grant. So they hightail it out of there and back into the coal lift ASAP. Phew, disaster averted. Donovan realizes their mistake. They started out on the basement floor, not the ground floor. So by going up 4 stories, they actually only got to the 3rd floor as opposed to the 4th floor where Pat's flat is. Now would be an excellent time to remind ourselves that Americans and British people number their floors differently. The 3rd floor in the UK is actually 4 stories up, 3 stories above the ground floor. Whereas in the US, the 3rd floor is only 2 stories above the ground floor, since what you all in the UK call the ground floor, we all in the US call the 1st floor. I think you could make arguments for and against both conventions. It actually can get quite confusing quite quickly, especially since I have to say there are plenty of buildings in the US that actually do have ground floors followed by a 1st floor. You just kind of have to pay attention when you go into an elevator to see what convention is being followed. But fortunately, this doesn't really matter so much in this story, since it's the relation of the flats to each other that's key, and not their relation to the ground floor. And as we've learned at this point, Mrs. Ernestine Grant's flat is directly below Pat's flat. Okay, so Jimmy and Donovan go up 1 more floor to Pat's flat, where they gain access via the coal lift, switch on the kitchen light, and let in the 2 young women who have come up to the regular front door in the stairwell, and at this point have been waiting quite some time. And Donovan and Jimmy relate their adventure. Pat comments, "I'm glad she didn't catch you. I'm sure she's an old curmudgeon. I got a note from her this morning wanting to see me sometime. Something she had to complain about. My piano, I suppose. People who don't like pianos over their heads shouldn't come and live in flats." She then casually tells Donovan to wash his hand because there's blood on it. Everyone assumes he cut it at some point during this adventure, but it turns out he didn't. At which point Donovan and Jimmy realize the blood must have come from Mrs. Ernestine Grant's flat. So Jimmy suggests they go back to Mrs. Grant's flat to see what's the matter. He and Donovan get back in that well-traveled coal lift and they go down to Ernestine Grant's flat and they go into the sitting room, which is where the blood must have been, because it's the only room where they touched anything. And at first they're stumped, but then Jimmy catches sight of a foot protruding from a curtain. It's a woman's foot in a gaping patent leather shoe. And yeah, that would be Mrs. Ernestine Grant, and she is very much dead. So Donovan goes to call the police while Jimmy volunteers to stay alone in the flat to keep an eye on things. That doesn't sound suspicious at all. As I was reading this, I was saying, I'm going to have to keep an eye on that Jimmy. Donovan goes up to Pat's flat, this time by way of the regular stairs. How boring of him. And he tells Pat what they've discovered, whilst internally monologuing about whether Pat loves him or loves Jimmy. But eventually he snaps back to reality and he says they have to phone the police. And this is when a voice behind them confirms the rightness of this procedure. The voice says, "Monsieur is right. And in the meantime, while we are waiting their arrival, perhaps I can be of some slight assistance. The man is standing above them, and he is the tenant of the flat above Pat Garnett. And this man says, I like to be up high in the air, the view over London. I take the flat in the name of Mr. O'Connor, but I am not an Irishman. I have another name. We, of course, know what this name is, and so does Pat. She recognizes him as the Monsieur Poirot. And Poirot tells her he nearly offered to help them earlier in the evening when he heard that they were having trouble getting into her flat. He says he could have picked her lock for her. That would have been no problem. I do not doubt Poirot on that score. He might be an armchair detective sometimes, but he's got some skills. I could see him easily jimmying a lock. So Poirot goes down to Mrs. Ernestine Grant's flat, where he proceeds to turn on the kitchen light, no problem. It's odd. And then he hears the sound of an unmistakable snore. It seems that a maid has been sleeping through all of this in a tiny bedroom that Christie describes as, quote, the kind of dog kennel designed by the builders of flats to accommodate a human being. Wow. This maid is just snoring away back there in the maid's quarters. But in the sitting room, Donovan is still wondering how he could possibly have gotten blood on his hand, given he never went near the body. Poirot points out that the cloth over the table in the sitting room is red. And doubtless, Poirot says, you did put your hand on the table. Poirot then finds the patch of blood in question, thereby deducing that the murder must have happened at the table, the body being moved later on. So then the police enter. We've got a police inspector, a constable, and the divisional surgeon. None of these men is Jap, unfortunately. The inspector's name is Inspector Rice, in case you were wondering. Poirot says they can do their thing while he and the four young things repair to Pat's flat, where she's going to fix them some omelets. Pat admits she does make omelets frightfully well. And then we get this gem of a reminiscence from Poirot. Once, mademoiselle, I loved a beautiful young English girl who resembled you greatly, but alas, she could not cook. So perhaps everything was for the best. Inspector Rice comes upstairs eventually, and he tells them a few more pertinent facts. It was the maid's evening out. She went out at 5 and then let herself in with her own key around 10. Before going to bed, she dropped off the letters that had arrived in the Evening Post on the table in the sitting room. She didn't see anything unusual at this point. The police also found a crumpled letter in Mrs. Grant's dress, which read the following, printed in small, prim capitals. I will come to see you this evening at 7:30. J.F. The pistol Mrs. Grant was shot with was found under her body, and it had been wiped of fingerprints with a silk handkerchief that was found dropped on the floor. This handkerchief had the name John Fraser stamped on it in the center. That, of course, matches the initials of JF on that printed note. So John Fraser seems to be the culprit, though Poirot points out that this John Fraser is a strange man. Careful, since he marks his handkerchiefs and wipes the pistol with which he has committed the crime, yet careless, since he loses his handkerchief and does not search for a litter that might incriminate him. But, whatever. Let's not listen to Poirot. Case solved. Am I right? I am not right. I am very much wrong. This is a Poirot short story, and that means we have a bridge of clues to get us to what is actually happening here. So, clue number 1, we've got the note from the supposed John Fraser, which is printed in capital letters. Well, the deduction here, which Poirot makes eventually, is that a handwritten note can be traced via handwriting analysis, and a typewritten letter can be traced to the specific typewriter that produced it. But by printing capital letters, this note has been rendered untraceable. Why? Perhaps because the note wasn't sent by John Fraser at all. Perhaps because John Fraser doesn't actually exist. Maybe John Fraser is one of the other characters in this story. All right, clue number 2. The body was moved from the table where Mrs. Grant was shot to behind the window curtains. But why? Well, we know that the maid entered the sitting room when she came back in from her evening out. If she'd been confronted with a dead body at that point, she would have, of course, called the police. So there must have been something crucial about delaying the discovery of the body beyond the point at which the maid came home. Well, what was the one thing the maid did when she came in? She put the evening's post on the table. All right, clue number 3. That supposed dud bulb in Mrs. Grant's kitchen. Well, it worked just fine when Poirot tried it. The deduction here is that Donovan Bailey must have been lying when he said it was a dud bulb. But why? Well, if he turned on the light in the kitchen, it would have been obvious at that point that they were in the wrong flat, and Donovan and Jimmy wouldn't have had a reason to go into the sitting room. So Donovan must have wanted to gain access to the sitting room for some reason. Clue number 4. Why did Donovan Bailey fumble around in the sitting room without turning the light on first? The deduction here is that he must have done so on purpose, because unlike the furniture in a room, the positioning of a light switch in flats that are stacked on top of each other in an apartment building is uniform. By which I mean the switch was in the same place in Mrs. Grant's flat as it was in Pat's flat, one story above. And Donovan was very familiar with Pat's flat. Christie actually loved playing around with this idea of one flat sharing characteristics with other flats in a building and using this as a means of murder. It's something she toyed with a lot in her notebooks. She kind of sort of uses it in Third Girl, but not to amazing effect, in my opinion. It's really not a spoiler. Also, though, going back to this specific instance of Donovan Bailey and the light switch in Mrs. Grant's flat, the switch is right by the door, of course. So even beyond knowing where the switch would be, sort of what height it would be and which side, it doesn't really make sense that he would be fumbling around for as long as he was inside the room. So Donovan must have been fumbling around in the dark on purpose. All right, clue number 5, that blood on Donovan's hand. Well, why exactly did he touch the table in the sitting room where the blood was? The deduction there is pretty easy. We now know that the evening's letters were sitting on that table. So there must have been a letter there that Donovan wanted for some reason. And we can be reasonably sure, even if we don't know why, that Donovan Bailey is our culprit. So let's move on over into the world as it actually is. The Bridge of Clues has gotten us almost all of the way there, though not quite. But have no fear, because Poirot is here to explain all, as he does. First, he says his goodbyes to the lovely Pat and the less lovely Mildred. Sorry, Mildred. And then out on the landing, Poirot asks Jimmy and Donovan to accompany him to Mrs. Grant's flat for a little more investigating. And Inspector Rice has helpfully provided Poirot with a key. So he's able to gain access to Mrs. Grant's flat again. And Poirot goes with these two young men into a little recess in the kitchen where he doubles over and roots around in an iron bin, emerging triumphantly with a little bottle that he sniffs at. But alas, Poirot says, "I am enrhumé. I have the cold in the head." So, at Poirot's request, Donovan takes the bottle from him, sniffs at it, smells nothing, and then Donovan just goes ahead and unstoppers it, taking another whiff. Poirot cries out, but it's too late. Donovan has taken a big old whiff of whatever is inside that bottle, and he falls like a log. Poirot sends Jimmy out of the room to fetch some brandy, and by the time Jimmy returns, Donovan is conscious again and getting a lecture from Poirot about the necessity of caution in sniffing at possibly poisonous substances. I think that is definitely a lesson that any character in a Christie story needs to learn, lest he or she learn it the hard way. I myself am always fearful of the scent of bitter almonds, having read as many Christies as I have. I'm not even exactly sure what bitter almonds smell like, but I've certainly thought a lot about this odor and imagined it on a number of occasions. So Donovan, now recovered, leaves. He's out. And Jimmy asks Poirot what's next. Poirot says nothing is next because he solved it. John Fraser is no one, just a name, a red herring, and Donovan Bailey is the real culprit. Poirot, of course, meant for Donovan to pass out from the ethyl chloride inside that little bottle Poirot had on his person. He only pretended to find it in Mrs. Grant's flat. Never underestimate Poirot's considerable abilities when it comes to sleight of hand. Also, we are in Poirot's apartment building, so I suppose he could have nipped on up to his own flat to retrieve this bottle of ethyl chloride, though it doesn't seem as if he had the opportunity to do so. So does he just always go around with bottles of ethyl chloride on his person? It's very possible. In any case, when Donovan was passed out and Jimmy was in the other room, Poirot, of course, rifled through Donovan's pockets and he found the key to Pat's flat in there, which Donovan stole earlier that evening, so he'd have an excuse to enter Mrs. Grant's flat without drawing suspicion to himself. And he also finds in Donovan's pocket the letter that Donovan took from the table in the sitting room. And that, of course, is what Donovan was after and the reason for this whole ruse with Pat's key. And what was in that envelope? Well, before he tells Jimmy, Poirot gets his Papa Poirot on big time here, and he asks young Jimmy whether or not he is in fact in love with Mademoiselle Patricia. Jimmy says, of course he cares for her, but he never thought he had a chance. And Poirot tells Jimmy, it is for you to make her forget, to stand by her in her trouble. Because Pat, you see, was the motive for the murder. The letter that Donovan stole from Mrs. Grant's table was from a solicitor, enclosing a certificate of marriage between Donovan Bailey and Ernestine Grant 8 years earlier in a foreign country. This was what Mrs. Grant wanted to talk to Pat about, and Donovan knew it. So what Poirot surmises is that Mrs. Grant, quote, must have told him that she had sent the marriage certificate to her solicitors and was expecting to hear from them. Doubtless he himself had tried to make her believe that there was a flaw in the marriage. So there we go. We already had our how, and now we have our why. The only issue, of course, with this story, beyond the fact that the murderer is named Donovan, but I have had a lot of fun saying the name Donovan as many times as I have in this summary. The only real issue is that apparently it's a massive coincidence that Mrs. Grant happens to live right above Pat. Poirot characterizes it as a strange irony that led the unfortunate woman to come to this building where her rival lived. I mean, couldn't Donovan have first seen Pat because he had to visit his estranged wife once and then the affair proceeded from there? Or conversely, couldn't Mrs. Grant have moved into the building specifically to amplify an ongoing threat she's been making to her estranged husband that she'll let his girlfriend know he's married? This is actually the tack that the Suchet adaptation takes, which we'll get to in a moment. I suppose my hang up about coincidences in Christie is my own hang up because Christie doesn't seem to be very bothered by them. And maybe I should just lighten up. I just don't like needless coincidences. And I think that it would have been very easy to excise this one from the story. The end. It's BritBox time, listeners. By this time, you probably know I've been a BritBox subscriber for years. They have the largest collection of Agatha Christie adaptations of any streaming service out on the market. And they also have so much more because they are the streaming home to all the best British mysteries. And for a limited time, I have an offer for all listeners in the US and Canada. Go to BritBox.com and use promo code Agatha for 50% off the first month of your monthly subscription. Do this and you can start watching not only Poirot, not only Marple, not only Tommy and Tuppence, but quality shows like the Sister Boniface series, which is a spin-off of the Father Brown series. It came out earlier this year, and I have been hugely enjoying it. I mean, it involves a nun in the 60s who solves crimes. Need I say more? I didn't think so. From the very first second I saw Lorna Watson's bespectacled face framed by that wimple, I was in. I'd say this is the most fun I've had with a fictional nun since Whoopi Goldberg in Sister Act 2, Back in the Habit. How's that for an endorsement? So again, if you are listening to me natter on right now in the US and Canada, go to BritBox.com and use coupon code Agatha, AGATHA, for 50% off the first month of your monthly subscription and start watching a ton of mysteries. All right, so before I get into the adaptations that exist for the Third Floor Flat, that's right, I said adaptations. I want to talk a little bit more about the brilliant idea that is at the heart of this short story. And that idea, of course, is that the murderer has to return to the scene of the crime several hours after the murder took place to retrieve something that won't be on the scene until then. And this necessitates both the secreting of the body and just a whole bunch of logistics, which could easily occupy a much meatier short story or even a full-length novel. So it's really no surprise that Christie came back to this short story at several points during her career. John Curran mentions the Third Floor Flat a couple of times in both volumes he produced about Agatha Christie's notebooks, Agatha Christie's secret notebooks, and then Murder in the Making, more stories and secrets from the notebooks. HarperCollins actually came out with a compilation of both those volumes in one single edition. If anyone is interested, I own them as two separate volumes, but this omnibus edition came out in 2019. It is 800 pages long. I may have to splurge and treat myself to the single edition, Agatha Christie's complete secret notebooks. Perhaps that can be my big indulgence once I complete the rankings for all 66 of Agatha Christie's full-length mysteries. I think I'll have deserved it by then. So per John Curran, Christie toyed around with the idea of redeveloping the short story in the mid-1950s. And then at another point in her notebook, she considers combining this idea with They Do It With Mirrors, in which the murder victim would be a, quote, fortune-telling woman, end quote. And there are even more notes in her notebooks where she fleshes out this expanded version with a fortune-telling woman, but she never followed through on the expansion, unfortunately. I, for one, would have loved to see Christie flesh out this very clever trick of a murderer having to return to the scene of the crime hours later, and especially with a fortune-teller victim. That would have been a fantastic novel. I should also note that this is one of the short stories Christie considered expanding when she and her publishers were trying to figure out which of her short stories they would collect for a book to be put out in 1960. This was when Christie was just too busy with other engagements, in particular theatrical engagements. So there was no Christie for Christmas in 1960 other than a collection of previously published short stories. The Third Floor Flat was not ultimately selected for inclusion in that collection, which came to be titled The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding and a Selection of Entrees. But I just wanted to note that because I think this is a little bit of a special one when it comes to the Poirot short stories. It's not particularly long. It's not even particularly flashy as a story, but it does have an exceedingly clever idea at the heart of it. This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. As you all know, it's been rather a tumultuous time for me since the end of last year, both for the tragic reason of losing my beloved partner on this very podcast, the one and only Catherine Probeck, and also for the joyous reason that I have a new baby in my life, my second child, who's doing great, by the way. But that is a lot on top of everything else going on in the world right now. And I speak from experience when I say I've truly benefited from talking to a therapist regularly during this period. Mental health is just so important, and it's crucial that we give ourselves the space and the tools to optimize our emotional well-being. That's why I'm so happy to be bringing you an opportunity from BetterHelp, which is not a crisis line or a self-help service. It's professional therapy done securely online, and it is available to people worldwide. You can schedule weekly video or phone sessions so you don't have to be on camera if you don't want to, and getting therapy every week is as easy as a few clicks on your laptop or phone. It's also more affordable than traditional offline therapy. Financial aid is also available. And the best news of all is that they have a special offer for all you listeners. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/Agatha. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/Agatha. Okay, so it is time now to talk about the adaptations of The Third Floor Flat. So the first adaptation is a radio adaptation. I'm, of course, getting this information from my good friend Mark Aldridge. The Third Floor Flat was adapted by the BBC for radio in 1954, and it starred the French actor Jacques Brunius. So that happened, but I was not able to listen to that radio adaptation. I was, however, able to watch the David Suchet adaptation that we have of this short story. And this is an early episode. The Third Floor Flat was adapted for episode 5 of season/series 1 of Agatha Christie's Poirot. According, again, to Mark Aldridge, when Rosalind and Anthony Hicks weighed in on which Poirot short stories they would select for adaptation in this first season/series of the Suchet program, this story was deemed, quote, poor, lacking in Poirot and out of tune with the others, end quote. And yet it was chosen anyway, and I'm glad that it was. So this episode allows David Suchet in Poirot and me to talk at great length about Charterhouse Square, which is where Florin Court is located. And Florin Court is the real-life building that stands in for Whitehaven Mansions on the series. This is what he writes. The story is almost entirely set in Poirot's Whitehaven Mansions, which is actually named Florin Court and lies in Charterhouse Square in London, not far from a 14th century monastery, which later became a Tudor mansion, an almshouse, and a school in the 17th century. Hidden away not far from Smithfield Market, Charterhouse is one of the most beautiful and secret of all London squares. On the east side, Florin Court was built in 1936 and consisted of 9 floors, a roof garden, and an indoor swimming pool, all in the Art Deco style. It is one of the best preserved of all the Art Deco blocks of apartments in London, which made it the perfect location for Poirot's flat, number 56B on the 5th floor. Regalian Properties refurbished the building in the 1980s and kindly allowed us to film there, but it still looked exactly as it had done when it was built. The stories in the first series were all set precisely at a time when the block would have been new, between 1936 and 1938, even though Dame Agatha had, in fact, written most of them a few years earlier. From the very beginning, Brian Eastman had been very keen to set all the films within a certain period of time to give them a particular look and feel. He also gets quite philosophical about Poirot's love of Pat's omelet in this story. This is an extended quotation from the book, but it's charming, and it shows just how deeply David Suchet thought about even the minutest aspects of his performance. He's talking about different actors who played supporting roles in the episode. The victim was played by the comedian Josie Lawrence in one of her first straight television roles. Most important of all, however, is the fact that the heroine of the story, played by Suzanne Burden, makes Poirot a fluffy omelet during his investigation, which only serves to remind him and me of his repressed love for a young Englishwoman in his past who once also made him fluffy omelets. But what did those omelets mean for a man like Poirot? I think they were a sign that he could only love at a distance, at one remove rather than as a red-blooded man. Dame Agatha could not and did not allow him to cross the barrier and release himself into a full relationship with a woman because it would have proved too great a threat to his personality. Poirot could admire, even love is in quotes, a woman, but it would always be from a distance, and I understood that instinctively, although it is not a feeling I share. Those omelets were a symbol of his remoteness, underlining the fact that Poirot was well aware of the fact that Suzanne's character reminded him of the love he could never quite have, and that affected me deeply. Once again, it helped me to understand his deep regret at never having truly experienced love, even though Dame Agatha did allow him a relationship with the dramatic Russian Countess Rosikoff, but one which was also destined to disappear into the wind. What was so charming was that Suzanne, and every other actor and actress who came into the series, was genuinely thrilled to be in a Poirot story. They all seemed to have known and read Poirot as a child, whereas I didn't know him at all to begin with, even though I was becoming him more completely every single day. He brings so much character into that book. Or I should say, he and Jeffrey Wansell, who he wrote it with, bring so much character into that book. Very, very charming. As is the episode itself. As we've come to expect from Agatha Christie's Poirot, it is extremely faithful to the puzzle Christie laid out in the text. And Brian Eastman et al. Really did make the best possible use of the location in this episode. There's this wonderful tracking shot that goes up the exterior of Florin Court as Whitehaven Mansions at the beginning of the episode, where we see Mrs. Ernestine Grant moving into her flat. And then above her, the camera pans from her living room window to the window one floor above, which features Pat and Mildred dancing to loud music that they're playing on a gramophone. And then we pan one floor above that, and we get to Poirot, who is very much suffering from a cold, which I'll get to in a second. But it's just a beautiful tracking shot, and it just makes such good use of that beloved curvaceous windowed exterior of Florin Court. It's such a great way to get into the episode. And of course, pertinent to the mystery that will ensue. And yeah, I just mentioned that Mrs. Grant is moving in at the beginning of the episode. This was the fix that they made to that rather awkward coincidence in the text where Mrs. Grant just happens to live below Pat. Mrs. Grant has moved in specifically to talk to Pat / harass Donovan, perhaps into getting back together with her. It's not exactly clear, but it's very believable. She just seems unhappy and as though she would like to have him back. And she is pulling out all the stops by moving in to Whitehaven Mansions, right underneath his beloved. I like it. It also allows them to do a little bit more of an involved red herring as to Mrs. Grant being a noise sensitive neighbor. We see her looking up to the ceiling where the quite loud music that Pat and Mildred are playing is leaking down into her unit. And when we see her slip the note underneath Pat's door saying, "I would like to speak with you later," it does seem as though she's going to speak about the noise and perhaps start banging on the ceiling with a broom handle. True story. I lived for 4.5 years in an apartment building in Venice, directly over the building's manager, what some would call the super or superintendent, although that's a bit more of an East Coast term. We don't really use that as much, I think, out here on the West Coast. But he was crazy. And anytime I would walk like a normal person, he would bang on the walls and or ceiling with a baseball bat. This was an apartment within walking distance of the Venice Boardwalk, and he actually did an act on the Venice Boardwalk. Other than being crazy and banging on the walls and ceiling with some regularity, he was actually a lovely man. And I learned how to walk in such a way that it wouldn't bother him. I kind of had to do a slow rolling walk. This sounds crazy, but it just became something I did. The problem is that whenever I had anyone over to my apartment, almost instantly, because they were walking like normal people, he would almost immediately start banging on the walls and or ceiling with a baseball bat. He was also always at home. I remember when I finally left that apartment, the owner of the building actually called me and said, "Is there anything we can do to keep you in the building?" And I remember saying, "No, there is not. And I think you're going to have a real problem finding someone who's going to deal with the manager's antics. I would suggest that perhaps you either leave that unit empty or have him occupy both units, because apparently he cannot handle living below anyone." Apartment living is not for the faint of heart in some ways, as this short story of Christie attests. I suppose it speaks to me. We have the usual hijinks that are filling out a somewhat slight short story so that the 50 minutes fly on by. Poirot, for instance, has a cold. Though allow me to remind you, he does pretend to have a cold in the story when he says, "Alas, I am enrhumé." And he does that to get Donovan Bailey to sniff that bottle of ethyl chloride he's planted. So maybe that was the genesis of this additional plot point. But there's some fun had with his ridiculous cold remedies.
Mr. Poirot, you've only done 7 minutes. You'll never cure your cold if you don't obey the instructions.
I can't imagine a method so undignified can cure anything. And now also I have the backache.
And when he goes outside, he looks like Gru from Despicable Me / the Minions Empire when he's all wrapped up in his heavy overcoat and scarf when he goes outside. It's very cute. This, unfortunately, is another episode in which I think Felicity Lemon, as brought to life by Pauline Moran, is criminally underused. She's barely there. Hastings makes his first appearance with a fast car that he just is head over heels in love with, which of course means that by the end of the episode, it will have been destroyed in a chase sequence. Poor Hastings. I appreciated what Mark Aldrich has to say about this episode in his book, Agatha Christie on Screen. So as usual, I'm going to quote from him as well. By the time the series reaches its 5th episode, The Third Floor Flat, adapted by Michael Baker, the core team of Poirot, Japp, Hastings, and Miss Lemon are well established. And so when a crime occurs in Poirot's own apartment building, this is a chance to not only cement Poirot's domestic arrangements, but also concentrate on a small-scale but highly satisfying mystery. As would often be the case, contemporary culture and technology are often mentioned by this point, with the key character singing along to "Life is Just a Bowl of Cherries," which is playing on a gramophone.
So how can you lose what you've never owned? Life is just a bowl of cherries.
Radio, music, travel, fashion, and cinema would all frequently feature throughout the series to help remind us of the period and also supply a quick way to make a particular point about either history or the nature of society at the time. In this instance, when Poirot pays a trip to the theater to see a play reminiscent of Christie's own Black Coffee, we may note his disdain for it. And I'll just interject here. In Christie's short story, the 4 young people have been out for the night. But what the adaptation does is that they place these four young people at a play, a murder mystery play, which Poirot and Hastings also attend. In fact, Hastings bets Poirot £10 that Poirot won't be able to figure out who done it by the end. The play itself is reminiscent of Black Coffee, but only in the worst of ways. It seems like a real turkey to me. And Poirot is convinced he's figured it out, but he hasn't, of course. He says the writer of the play is an imbecile because the writer didn't play fair.
Perhaps it is time I retire, Hastings.
I say, Poirot, you're beginning to make me feel badly about all this.
No, not at all. Hercule Poirot is a man of his word, even if the playwright is not. We were not given all the facts. It was only at the end that we discover that Major Sadler is Lady Muriel's son. And the theater has made my cold even worse.
Poor Poirot is very unhappy until, of course, a murder happens in his very apartment building. And this becomes a problem set forth in front of him for him to solve. And his cold disappears and he regains his equanimity. Returning to Mark's summation of the episode. At the end, the story's small scale is opened out somewhat as we witness one of the first of many car chases that often resolve Poirot episodes, largely unnecessary in plot terms, but lavish and entertaining for the audience, especially as it dovetails neatly with Hastings' restoration of his car. I love that this is one of the first of those car chase sequences that Catherine and I have spent so many years lightly ribbing and cherishing at the same time. Donovan Bailey, of course, tries to hoof it. In the story, Poirot is just like, yeah, we'll get him eventually. He's not really going anywhere. But in the episode, we, of course, have to have our dramatic chase sequence, and poor Hastings' fancy sports car is destroyed, and Hastings is very, very sad.
That front axle's just sheared right through.
Oh, mon pauvre Hastings. But you must not brood. You must occupy yourself, huh? Go and telephone the Chief Inspector Jacques and tell him we have caught his fish.
What's happened to Donovan?
It'll need a whole new front end.
The tables have been turned, and it was Hastings trying to cheer up Poirot in the beginning, and now it is Poirot trying to cheer up Hastings in the end, because that is what friends are for, people. I do have to point out that in one aspect, the episode actually features a more streamlined telling of the story. Donovan and Jimmy find Ernestine Grant the first time that they gain access to the flat. Unlike in Christie's version, where they leave the flat, and it's not till Pat notices the blood on Donovan's hand that he and Jimmy go back to the flat. And at that point, they find Mrs. Grant's body. I'm not sure why we have that awkward sequence in Christie's version, the doubling back in that way. A doubling back on top of the doubling back that we eventually learn is central to the solving of the mystery. Maybe she simply needed the story to be a certain length, or maybe she thought finding blood and not knowing where it came from on Donovan's hand was an effective moment in the story. I suppose it is, actually. It's a bit upsetting, a bit discomposing. And of course, we don't have Inspector Rice in this story. We have Inspector Japp. He is the inspector who comes on the scene and is there when Poirot solves the case. But I'm always happy to see Philip Jackson. Yet another charming entry in the charming Agatha Christie's Poirot program, especially in those early episodes. I love them so. And now I can return to the sadness that I referenced at the beginning of the episode, because we only have 3 more of those episodes to watch. There are 2 more Poirot short stories that we have yet to cover. And of course, Curtain is yet to be reviewed and ranked on this podcast. But first, before Curtain, we will be covering in our next episode, Sleeping Murder, the final Miss Marple novel published. And yes, this is out of order. As I indicated at the end of the last episode, I am honoring Catherine's wishes and covering Sleeping Murder second to last, even though it was published last, so that the final novel reviewed and ranked will be Curtain, Poirot's final case. That is what she wanted, and I am thrilled to be able to honor that wish. So in 2 weeks' time, we will be back in the Marpleverse. I will be joined by Tony Medower, who Catherine and I met while he was doing some work for the International Agatha Christie Festival. But Tony is a mystery scholar extraordinaire. His knowledge of Christie is just so prodigious. I know I can be hyperbolic and overly enthusiastic, especially when I'm talking about all of the wonderful people that Catherine and I have met in the course of this podcast. But I really do mean it when I say that I cannot wait to share with you the wealth of information and expertise that Tony is going to bring to our review of Sleeping Murder. I'm very, very excited for that episode. And of course, should you want even more content, you can always go to the podcast Patreon account over at www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. July's bonus Patreon episode is all about the Mary Westmacott novel, Giant's Bread. Really enjoyed covering that one for all the patrons over at Patreon. You can email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And please give the podcast a rating and or a review if you haven't yet done so. We've gotten a few recently, which makes me so happy, but we could always use more. And I will see you next time. Bye.